Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. Now, today, I want to set the record straight on one of the most underestimated sectors of our economy. Simon, if you had asked me a while ago, I would have said that manufacturing in Australia is dead. But then I read one of your articles in the New Daily, which explained that Australian manufacturing isn't just surviving, it's actually entering a new era of growth and innovation, Simon.
Yes, and you'd be, of course, excused to think about manufacturing declining, because over the last decade, we read so many headlines of big, iconic manufacturers closing, Holden's out, Ford's out, we don't have a car industry anymore. That makes sense that you then feel that manufacturing is well and truly on the way out. The share of workers in manufacturing absolutely plummeted over the decade. So it makes sense to think this, and a doom and gloom narrative, of course, always gets caught in the news when you see, there's the threat of this smelter closing, of this factory being at risk and so forth. So it makes sense to think.
It's even more so recently with all the tariffs, etc., and the discussion about manufacturing around the world. So I'd like you to explain what's going on. And for those of you watching or listening, if you're a business owner or an investor, please stick around, because I want to get Simon's knowledge about some of the innovations and the transformations shaping this crucial sector, because this is the sort of information business owners and investors need to know to understand what's ahead for our future. So Simon, I'll leave a link to your article in the New Daily in the show notes, but it starts off with a provocative statement. You say that manufacturing isn't dead despite the widespread belief. So maybe you can just explain that a little bit more.
We still have around 900,000 people working in manufacturing. That is a very significant share of 14 million workers are in manufacturing. That number is solid. That number was bigger in the past, but it wasn't hugely bigger. It was 1.1 million was the absolute peak of people that we had employed in manufacturing.
That's not that much different, is it?
No, it is a decline, a significant decline, but it's not the death of manufacturing. It is, in a sense, the adjustment of an economy that turned away from this manufacturing economy, this industrial economy, more and more towards a knowledge economy where we have these office-based jobs. And so we still have a base of manufacturing that is well, but I'd argue that probably the total number of people employed in manufacturing was also impacted by a shift, if you will, statistical shift of jobs, because traditionally lots of people that worked in manufacturing had jobs where they managed inventory, where they worked in a warehouse, where they had a forklift to drive equipment that was needed on the production line from the warehouse to the thing. That was done in-house, and so technically they were manufacturing industry workers. We since then discovered that just-in-time delivery methods in manufacturing make sure that the manufacturer themselves need to have only smaller warehouses, which makes it cheaper because you don't have to have all the inventory. And so the inventory just gets stored into the logistics sector. So we pushed workers that would have driven a forklift under the umbrella of manufacturing, and they now drive a forklift under the umbrella of logistics, of warehousing. So ultimately, I'd say the workforce in manufacturing is probably roughly as big as it was at the peak of Australian manufacturing, which sounds very counterintuitive.
Yes.
But the reality, of course, is that the share of workers in manufacturing well and truly plummeted. This was the biggest sector at the heyday of manufacturing in the 70s. And this is when manufacturing ruled supreme. That's not the case anymore. It's not that anyone that you know has a family member working in manufacturing.
So while the number of people working in manufacturing is much the same as a percentage, because our population has grown significantly, you're saying there is a percentage for Australians. I remember way back there was a lot of protection for Australia's manufacturing, for example, the tariffs on cars and other imported goods to protect Australia's manufacturing industry. In fact, when I grew up, a lot of my parents' friends were migrants and they brought trades here and they were manufacturing clothes here, shoes here, all sorts of things which just don't make sense or money anymore.
No, exactly. And that's the shifting reality. So we did realize that you produce in Australia at high wages and you produce it's not the best, most efficient way of producing stuff. We saw this under the free trade world, where it was cheaper to manufacturing shoes partially in one country, then you finish them in another country, and then you ship them to Australia. It was ultimately cheaper. And we all of a sudden then had enough stuff to do for Australians. So we didn't need to put everyone into manufacturing jobs. So that's a global market efficiency that finally allowed us to limit those trade barriers, those tariffs. And now we have fewer local manufacturing jobs, but we don't have high unemployment because we did figure out other stuff to do for our Australian worker bees.
Well, if you think about it, Donald Trump's been saying with his tariffs, I want to bring manufacturing back to America. They remember the good old days when I guess Detroit produced lots of cars and lots of things were happening. I don't think the factories in America or today in Australia would look anything like the ones in the past. You wouldn't have people on production lines anymore, would you?
Not at all. If you think about a factory today and a factory in the East, they are vastly different beasts. First and foremost, the average manufacturing worker today is more highly educated than a previous manufacturing worker because they need to operate more complex machinery. They operate in just-in-time delivery systems. They constantly need to be upskilled for new technology coming online. So that's different. They also get better compensated. Unfortunately, housing and cost of living is even more expensive than the increased compensation. So manufacturing workers certainly don't feel richer, but the wages are better than they were in the past, but it only gets you so far. And that's it. When you think about the US and you think about, well, what do we want? We put trade barriers on there, and then we manufacture more stuff in the US. Like, okay, I get it. I get the intent. But in order to produce something in-house, you need a couple of things. First and foremost, you need to make sure that you have enough workers that are willing to do those jobs. It's questionable whether the US has that. Many people would argue that they don't. Then you need to make sure that this is actually the most efficient thing, or are you just driving prices up for this? And I understand that, personally, I would only push something like the tariff policy in the US for strategically important things. So if the US is convinced that they want to go head to head with China, you know that you need to push the whole chip supply chain, semiconductor supply chain into the US. And you protect that. You get highly qualified people to do this. You replicate this really complex global supply chain solely within your own borders. I'd get that. That would be a legit strategy, but putting tariffs on absolutely everything seems mad because there's no way that the US is going to produce cheap electronics, or baby strollers. All of these things, I think it's something like 94% of baby strollers used in the US are manufactured in China. No chance in hell that they will produce them themselves. It makes no sense. It's low-tech product to have this in your country. They don't have the capacity for it. So who knows what's happening there?
Much the same would happen with clothing as well, wouldn't you?
Exactly. Up to the point where you say we can completely 100% automate a construction process, because then you say, well, we operate the robots, they cost the same amount of money wherever you go, and it's just a matter of energy costs, and the US does have cheap energy. So it's a completely autonomous or mostly autonomous manufacturing process. Why wouldn't we run this in-house? I get it, but a lot of the manufacturing, if you look at clothing, if you look at chemicals, still involve an awful lot of humans in low-income countries. And is this all going to happen in the US? Because the US so far argues that the workers do not want to work in manufacturing jobs, the American workers. So I'm not sure how they would fill those skills shortages there. So it seems a bit like a mess here. But if we go back to the Australian days, where we strategically rolled back tariffs because we said, yeah, we will allow more consumer goods into Australia so that Australians have cheaper access to consumer goods. All the while, we figured out other stuff for Australians to do. I think that's a useful way of removing tariffs or amping them up. If we said we had a massive shortage, we had a high unemployment rate, you'd use it this way. So the US doesn't have either of those.
When you look back 20, 30, 40 years ago when Australia was manufacturing a lot more, we had migrants who were actually coming in without skills and working in factories. And a lot of Australians were happy to have a job there. Today, I don't think many people wake up in the morning aspiring to work on a production line, Simon. It's
Not
not a
really.
judge of people or
No,
a
no.
judge of jobs, but I think we've got more aspiration today.
Exactly. And it's also partially a narrative that we've been telling. So if you've ever watched a TED talk in the last decade, you know that the narrative is pretty clear. Your career is a failure if you can't bring your whole value, your whole passion to the workplace on every single day. And that's a tall order to ask for a assembly line type job. Yes, you can be proud of your work. You can do this with whatever job, but is this your whole personality, your whole true self? It's not. And it's, by the way, not for most jobs of our 14 million jobs. So we do have this utterly unrealistic expectation of how cool a job should be that we push on our young people. And that ultimately is hurting manufacturing, unless, of course, you put the technological spin on it. Because the manufacturing workers of today in the fully automated, or not fully, mostly automated production processes at the cool factories, there's a lot to be proud about. It's a very technical job for the people who want to fiddle with technology, who see the joys of operating these complex processes. I get that. But in Australia, again, what do we need to manufacture? There's this whole economic baseline logic. I think I made the point before that we can be very glad that Australian car manufacturing left the country when it did, 16. And imagine it had still been around in 2020 when the pandemic had hit. Then
Yes.
it would have shut down from one day to the next and it would have gone bust. So we had this orderly retreat rather than this massive implosion of the whole system. So it was very lucky for us to not have to bail out a hold of foreign workers, because this would have made inflation even worse. We would have gone into even more debt under this. So it's not smart for a country to maintain an industry that is utterly uncompetitive and too much reliant on outdoor inputs and on kind of like tariff barriers that in the long run doesn't make for an efficient economy. And we know in Australia that we do need to increase productivity. So for us, it's a matter of what's the stuff in Australia that we can produce very efficiently and where we add productivity, so to speak, meaning dollar per hours put in. So dollar output for hours put in. And I would always argue that the low-hanging fruit in manufacturing in Australia are value-added manufacturing to our most important industries, which are mining and food or agriculture. So food production would be value-added to agriculture. So do not export wheat, export a cereal product. That would be food manufacturing. That gets you more bang for your buck. It would be to export aluminum rather than iron ore, or something like this, steel rather than iron ore. What all of those manufacturing processes have in common that they need, the value-added manufacturing processes, is that they need a bucket load of energy. And despite being one of the big energy exporters of the world, in Australia, energy is very expensive to use, which is why, just from a global perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever to value add to the mining products here. You'd rather ship the iron ore on to a Chinese, Indonesian port and value add there and then ship it somewhere else from there on. So that's something we could be doing if we had a strategic energy policy that would focus on this. I would like to see discussions like this, but it's quite easy that people just say, nah, it's too expensive, it's too hard, let's not even worry about it. But then when you talk about strategic positioning of a country, that's the kind of stuff we should talk about.
Well, high-tech manufacturing is something we just touched on a moment ago. More innovation, more automation, more technology. What industries are there then that Australia could carve out its little niche in the world and take advantage of?
Yeah, so we do have a Australian manufacturing strategy that says what kind of new things we should focus on. And that makes sense to me. So we saw during the pandemic that there were quite a few supply chain disruptions. And so you go, ooh, that's actually quite dramatic. If you don't get your clothing from Temu shipped into the country, how important is that? It's not very important. But all of a sudden we found a shortage of medical equipment, of medicine. And you go, okay, so that's a problem. So you go, okay, we must have some sort of limited supply or manufacturing sector in Australia that produces medicine in-house, and that can then be revamped if there is a major supply chain disruption, be this a pandemic, be this a natural catastrophe, be this an unnecessary trade war between two major superpowers. That makes sense. And the same logic applies for military equipment, because we do see that that's well, that's not important. Let's say it's a likely development in the future that we will see more rather than less defense spending in most countries around the globe. And so you'd want to produce that stuff in-house. It's stable.
Submarines, for example.
Submarines, bush rangers, so we do have a vehicle production still in Australia, but it's military equipment. You are not going to buy a bush ranger and drive through Brighton.
No. Look, given the global push towards sustainability, how's Australia's manufacturing sector going to adapt to environmentally friendly practices? Is there anything you can think about?
Well, I think we could be well positioned because we do have strong regulations. But again, this is about energy. So if we had plenty of affordable energy in Australia, and if this energy also was greenish, we could make an argument for we better produce more stuff here because it's more environmentally friendly. You shorten delivery routes, you shorten supply chains, and you ensure that your own clean energy is being used. That, of course, assumes that Australia actually does create its own green energy supply, which we're not doing nearly enough to do this. But yeah, I think this could be in the future. This could be a future development where we go more and more of this. And of course, we might be seeing the amping up of Australian manufacturing if we become increasingly concerned about global free trade. So if we say it's not guaranteed that stuff actually ships freely around the globe, because the American security guarantee doesn't work anymore. Between the Chinese and the America, there's more and more beef so that they don't allow ships to move freely around our neck of the woods. That could be a problem. And then we would probably think about doing more stuff in-house. Is that a positive development? Probably not. But ultimately, if you zoom out, manufacturing will become more automated, more and more, which means the cost of robots is the most important capital cost upfront, and then the running cost is mostly energy.
Energy, yeah.
So if you want manufacturing, you need to make energy cheaper. And energy should be half price in Australia, at the very least, to what we have now.
Now, we've spoken in previous podcasts about Australia's demographic urbanisation. By the way, if you're new to this podcast, whether you're watching us or listening to us, if you'd like to go back to previous episodes, you'll hear Simon and me talk about Australia's demographic changes. There's lots of information in previous chats. And if you're finding this interesting, why not click the subscribe button so you get regular sessions? But in previous chats, we talked about how we tend to want to live in a number of large capital cities around the coast, while in general we could maybe get rid of some of the challenges if we encouraged regional development. Is there room for manufacturing in regional areas in Australia, or is transport too big an issue?
No, I think there is totally the opportunity to do this. So remember that we pretty much, as Australians, live in the same cities that we have lived in 100 years ago. We just made those cities bigger. We have not introduced new cities at scale, even though we massively mushroomed our population. That is a bit odd. And you could say, let's produce important stuff in Australia and build cities around this at important transport corridors. First and foremost, thinking about manufactured housing. I'm thinking about factory-built automated houses that is largely built with robots. You have, of course, tradies on site as well, particularly for the electronics, electrical elements and the plumbing elements of the build. But so you build a house in segments, in a factory, in a roof, no bad weather, much less material wastage, much more robotics, hopefully as many local building materials in there as possible. That should be possible this way to produce housing cheaper. And then the house gets shipped to site and gets Legoed together there, because ultimately your house is just, or most Australian houses are just a couple of wall and roof elements that could be pre-built in a factory and then linked together on site. So we could speed up housing production, you could make it cheaper, and you could use less materials to do so.
Less wastage.
So it's an environmental win. It would help to increase the housing supply, which is the big talking point, of course, in Australia's housing crisis. So I think that's something that we should focus on, that we should quite honestly have a massive, massive driver. And this should be an investment effort that is underwritten by government, that is supported by super funds, meaning an institution that has decades on decades onwards as a horizon. Because setting up a crazy automated factory that builds housing elements is extremely capital intensive. And so even a Mervec land lease aren't rich enough to pull this off. So it does need a couple of bigger institutions in there as well. But why wouldn't we do this as a new city? You literally build a manufacturing city and then bit by bit accompanying industries settle around this. You would settle cheap as in this new city. So it would be very attractive for young families to set up, their lives there. I can see this work, but it would be a multi-stakeholder effort to set this town up.
Yes, it would be a real game changer, though, too, wouldn't it? Now, I know in your role as a consultant at the demographics group, your team consult to governments, institutions, organisations. What role do you see for governments in supporting our manufacturing in Australia? Should they be? How should they be doing it?
Yeah, sometimes people point to specific policies targeting more manufacturing. And this goes like cheap land, tax concessions. I would say, no, we still want the market to regulate what works and what doesn't work. But if you want more local manufacturing, you want to make energy cheaper. So I think energy is the missing link here. Yes, you can make TAFE free so that you can create a manufacturing worker who needs to be much more skilled than in the past. You can create them through the TAFE system. You can't just throw any old 16-year-old school leaver in there. You do need training. So TAFE would be one lever, and I would always point to energy as the most important lever. So we need energy policy that actually makes energy cheaper. I do not ever want to see governments giving you electricity rebate, where just the government pays part of your bill. That's stupid. Energy didn't get cheaper. It's just someone else who paid for it. We need to find a way to produce energy cheaper, and that has largely to do with taxation of how we tax energy, what we demand from the energy companies that extract minerals from Australia. Australian energy could be half price easily, and we need to get there. This needs to be a policy priority. And if this was to be in place, more manufacturing would naturally follow, because with every cent that your gigawatt hour gets cheaper, another manufacturing operation becomes economically viable.
Now, I spoke a moment ago about the fact that you spend most of your day advising organisations, institutions, governments, state authorities too. So if people want to be in contact with you and have you speak to them, I'll leave a link in the show notes. How do you add value to these clients of yours?
Well, we always try to tell our clients what their world, which they know very, very well, looks like through the demographic lens. So we add one perspective, the demographic perspective, to an already existing bouquet of worldviews that the client already has. And we well and truly believe at the demographics group that any additional perspective that you add on your problem, on your issue, makes you a better business owner, public servant, father, whatever it is. So more perspectives are better, and we offer you one perspective.
I'll leave a link in the show notes for how people can get in contact with you and find out how you can help them improve. Now, just to finish off then, what are some of the emerging trends you can see in the future, talking about the future, which is what a demographer should do? Are there new technologies or market demands or anything that you think would be reshaping our manufacturing in Australia?
Yeah, what comes to mind is automation, is robotics, is that manufacturing looks increasingly more high-tech, which makes it more capital intensive from the get-go. And of course, you have high electricity costs. So that's definitely the biggest issue there. And then what are market demands? Well, we are very, very demanding consumers in Australia. We consume a lot. So, and money is a bit tight. So market demands is just for more and cheaper goods. And we can't compete on all of those things. So many of these new manufacturing opportunities will be taking place outside of Australia, where it is just cheaper to produce stuff. And then we are rich enough to use our money to buy that stuff. But the Australian future of manufacturing definitely lies in things where supply chain sovereignty is crucial. So we are seeing more pharmaceuticals, biotech. There's no reason that that all those biotech companies, they are footloose. They can literally set up anywhere. They just need a deep labor pool of highly trained, uni-educated folks. Melbourne, Sydney, easy. Brisbane, no worries. These startups could sit here, these new technologies that would then eventually lead to certain kind of manufacturing in the pharmaceutical space or in the medical space. So it's a hyper-specific stuff that would work really well. Mass manufacturing of clothing in Australia, probably not. Electronics, definitely not. Low margin stuff will not occur here. But we, of course, will see defense because defense is of national importance. So it's not as important how expensive the bush ranger is that we bolt together in Australia. It is more important that we do it in-house, that we have full control over the technology and as much control as we can have over the supply chain so that no other, evil actor can destroy our supply chain.
Well, I learned something. Manufacturing isn't dead. It's just looking different, and it's still got a significant role in making Australia great. Next week, Simon, I'd like to get back to one of the topics we've discussed a bit in the past, and that's how we live, where we live, because we both recognise that demographics is going to be our destiny for our property markets as well. So let's have a look at how we are living around Australia next week. Look forward to catching up with you then.
That'll be a fun discussion.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.